Today's lecture is Chapter 13 in your criminal procedure textbook. It starts on page 320. It's going to talk a little bit about the different types of sentencing guidelines and different types of sentencing that exists, and then appeals. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on appeals because it's really not something that we need to get too in depth with, but we do need to be aware of what essentially it stands for. So let's go ahead and start with the there's different sentencing philosophies, and those are listed on page 322. Every undergraduate class that I've ever had, and even grad school, that talks about like typically probation and reintegrating individuals into society that have committed crime will cover these specific retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, specific and general deterrence, and rehabilitation. All of those things are something that are focused on, and a lot of times we see this in the actual inner workings of the court system, but we don't actually understand specifically what they individually are. We don't know, like, hey, that's deterrence, or hey, that's rehabilitation. It's just something that happens. The court system has generated a product that we're made aware of. But specifically, typically juvenile offenders focus more so under rehabilitation, right? These are younger people, younger children who essentially cannot be considered to be culpable for a crime that they've committed because of their age, which is why we have juvenile offenses that exist. In the state of Georgia, the youngest that somebody can be held responsible for a crime is 13 years of age. Typically that's going to be looking at your armed robbery, murder, kidnapping, things of that matter. But specifically, juvenile would look at rehabilitating that person, right? Making sure that they're figuring out what's wrong that caused them to commit that crime. Whereas typically adults, mostly, they're going to be rehabilitated, but a lot of times it's looking at deterrence, sending them to prison, retribution if they've done something horrible to somebody else. The judge may sentence them to life in prison, or even give them the death penalty. So just be aware that there's different options that the courts have or that exist, but nonetheless not each one of them is necessarily specific to a specific crime or anything like that. It's more so based off of the general individual circumstances surrounding it. One of the things that we talk at is the deterrence, right? Making sure that an individual maybe won't commit a certain crime again. One of the ways that we try to do this, if I can think of, maybe like sex offenders, right? Sex offenders have to register, they have to go through regular meetings, their attendance has to be regular as far as meeting with people to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're living where they're supposed to be living, they're not around certain groups of people, they're not in school zones, right? We keep tabs on these people. We're making sure that we're deterring them from putting them in a position where they could in fact offend again. It's not a 100% safe solution, but it's something that's a tactic that's put in place to make sure that people are in fact doing what they're supposed to be doing. Page 324 talks a lot about the different types of laws that exist. Don't get too focused on that, but certainly maybe worth your while to read through and understand what they are. Obviously, misdemeanor sentencing, a misdemeanor is a crime that's punishable by up to a year. So it could be 2 months on probation, it could be a year on probation, but it can't be 13, 14, 15, or 18 months on probation. Misdemeanor status only carries 1 year. Felony, of course, is any crime that's committed that is 1 year or greater, right? So the minimum that somebody could be put on probation or sentenced to, or a felony charge, would be 1 year. Typically we see probation sentences for possession of meth or DUI or something of that nature. Say a felony charge for possession of meth. Possession of meth is a felony offense in the state of Georgia. That offense typically would carry anywhere from 18 to 36 months on probation. Typically a pretty good fine associated with that. But there are different types of sentencing guidelines that exist: a indefinite, a definite, and an indeterminate sentencing. These are all listed in your textbook. I really wouldn't get too focused on them. There is a quiz question that talks about it, so I'm going to go over it. A definite sentence is a sentence that has a specified period of confinement. If they say the person's been sentenced to 5 years in a correctional facility, right, it doesn't open it up and say after 5 years they can be released. It's specifically 5 years incarcerated in a correctional facility. Indefinite, of course, would be that there's no fixed term. It can be adjusted specifically depending on the offender. indefinite. Maybe they're sentenced to 10 years for a crime. They get 1 year credit for time served, but they're required to serve 8 years, right? So if they got 10 years that they're required to serve for an offense, 8 years to serve in actual confinement, and they've already served 1 year in the facility, technically they would only have 7 years left on their sentence, right? Of the 7 years, they may be able to be eligible for parole after 3, 4, 5 years, something of that matter. Depends on what the offense is. But just know that there's a specific offense schedule that the Georgia Pardons and Parole Board has that looks at the specific offenses and determines the actual length that an individual would have to possibly serve. And then indeterminate sentence is based on a period of confinement other than punishment, and it's based off of the need of the specific offender. So just be aware of what those are. Just know that typically juries don't impose the sentencing guidelines, they just find somebody guilty or not guilty. Typically juries, once they find somebody guilty, they walk out and they don't know what happens to the sentencing. The sentencing is determined based off of the offender's history. Certain offenses have mandatory minimums people have to be sentenced to, but ultimately that the judge is the deciding factor in that. We talked about probation. Obviously, probation is an alternative to confinement. Parole, of course, being confinement, and then after a period being released and serving the remaining portion of your sentence on parole. But probation can typically is done with most misdemeanor offenses, and then even a lot of your felony offenses, drug charges, and things of that nature that are felony offenses will actually be put on probation. Suspended sentences mean that the individual can serve, if they serve early termination, say they sentenced to 3 years on probation, and after 18 months on probation, if they've done what they're supposed to do, they've paid their fines, they haven't reoffended, their sentence can potentially even be suspended. The remaining balance of it can be suspended. Fines are a big thing. So when somebody gets sentenced to probation, they may get possession of meth charge. They get 18 months on probation, a $2,000 fine, and have to go through substance abuse counseling class, anger management, possibly, things of that matter, community service. There's certain requirements that they have to have. All the offenses, everything that I've ever seen, guys, there's almost always a fine involved with it. So just if you get arrested for disorderly conduct, you may get no probation but a $500 fine. Fines are the way that the courts make money. It's the way that they pay for the services that the court system provides to people. Just be aware that there's a fine schedule typically that goes over what specific fines would in fact be appropriate. And then we talk about appeals. Just know that appeals, once the case has gone through trial, the person has been found guilty, the defense typically will file an appeal for that individual. Could be the judge messed up in giving the jury instructions. There could have been initially a technicality that occurred during the trial that they feel like is significant enough that could basically benefit them if the case were to go to appeal, to benefit their client. It's not a mistrial, but it's basically saying that the person's been found guilty. At face value, everything looks okay, but there may have been something, a technicality that wasn't done. There's appeal lawyers. That's literally all they do is they look at finding issues with court cases to make sure that everything was done properly. This week in the chapter we have a discussion question and a reflective journal. For this week we're going to go ahead and do the chapter 13 discussion question, imprisonment versus probation. The question goes over, says, pretend you've just been convicted of a felony crime and are going in front of the judge for sentencing. As a convicted felon, what advantages do you see with being granted probation? Which conditions of probation do you believe would be most challenging for you, and under what conditions, if any, would you consider requesting imprisonment rather than probation? Same thing, guys. Give me 5 to 7 sentences somewhere in that area. explaining yourself. This one requires a little bit more detail than some of the other ones, so make sure that it's a fairly decent response. And then later this week, the next, I guess, Thursday morning, I'll post the quiz. We'll do a quiz review, and then we'll allow you to take the quiz if you guys have any questions with the PowerPoint. Let me know. I'm happy to answer any questions if I can. Email me, text me, call if you need to, whatever you need to do if there's any issues with it. But I think we're starting to get to the point where these chapters are kind of winding down, and we're starting to see that a lot of the stuff is tying into it, and we've already discussed it in great detail, so we're just kind of touching on it. But other than that, I hope everything goes okay with you guys. If you have any questions, once again, let me know. Thank you.